On that morning, the atmosphere at the international airport was preparing for the flurry of flights scheduled. Throughout the day, the warm sunlight streamed through the glass windows of the duty-free shops, reflecting the shimmering light onto luxury suitcases and the hurried footsteps of hundreds of passengers. Among the crowd, one family stood out not because they carried expensive clothes or items, but because of the way they moved, their calm and confident demeanor as they entered this space. Marcus and Amara Whitmore, along with their two children, Tiu Lai and Tiu Min, walked into the check-in area for their flight. Amara held Tiu Lai's hand, gazing at her daughter with a loving look as she gently reminded, "Make sure to keep your belongings safe." Marcus, with a charming smile, stood beside his son Tiu Min, who was always curious about everything around him, prompting his father to continuously answer his questions. "How can the plane fly without falling?" "Dad, because it has very powerful engines." "Son, and also because it's very big." The Whitmore family, with their simple and elegant appearance, seemed like any other family in first class, everything proceeding smoothly in a space filled with peace. Amara and Marcus had booked first-class tickets long ago, and they were looking forward to a relaxing flight with their family. After months of busy work and everyday life, everything seemed like it would be just another normal flight. But little did they know, in just a few minutes, this flight would become an unforgettable milestone in their lives. After completing the check-in process, they were escorted to the first-class area, where the luxurious cabin immediately made them feel at ease. The soft leather seats, the crisp white blankets, and the elegantly arranged snacks made the children excited. Tiu Lai, the 8-year-old girl, sat in her seat with eager eyes, while Tiu Min, although young, could not help but feel thrilled sitting in first class, where everything was new and full of excitement. Darren, father and CEO of a large corporation, sat next to Tiu Min, gently putting headphones on his son and reminding Tiu Lai, "Remember to sit still. We're going to fly very high." Amara sat beside them, taking care of her two children, her eyes always fixed on them with utmost care. This flight was truly a special occasion for their family, a small but complete moment of happiness. However, while the family was enjoying the quiet atmosphere, a figure passed by them. It was flight attendant Vanessa, a woman with a stern face and cold eyes. She walked over, holding a tablet and looking at their family as if she was checking something. When she approached, Marcus felt a slight tension in the air, but he couldn't understand why. "Hello, I'm Vanessa, the flight attendant," she said in a cool tone, not acknowledging the calmness in the family's space. "There seems to be an issue with your seating." Marcus looked up, surprised, and asked, "We checked in earlier. This is the seat we've had reserved for a long time." Vanessa did not provide further explanation, simply replying, "There's an issue with the passenger list. We need you to move to the back to accommodate a priority passenger." Her voice was no longer gentle, but sharp and decisive. Amara glanced at her husband with suspicion, but Marcus calmly said, "We purchased first-class tickets, and we have the right to sit here." Yet there was no change in Vanessa's attitude. She repeated the request, making the situation even more confusing. "No, I cannot move," Amara said firmly, but still remained calm. "This is the seat I reserved, and I want to stay with my family." Vanessa did not ask for any further clarification or provide an explanation. She simply coldly told Amara, "If you don't move, I'll have to call ground staff to handle it." And so, Amara reluctantly stood up, taking her purse, and left her first-class seat. Amid the silence of the entire cabin, the atmosphere became heavy and tense. Passengers in the first class began turning their heads toward the Whitmore family, but no one spoke. Something had happened, but no one dared confront it. Amara walked away silently, while Marcus remained seated, his gaze fixed on the empty seat beside him. The passengers around were silent, but in their minds, one question lingered. What will happen next? As Amara walked down the narrow aisle of the plane, she could feel the coldness in the air. The first-class seats had now become places that no longer belonged to her. The feeling of being out of place overwhelmed her heart, but she did not let it show outwardly. She walked with her back straight, eyes fixed ahead, but inside, there was a sadness that words could not express. Tiu Lai and Tiu Min watched their mother, their eyes full of confusion and concern. But both children stayed silent, still unable to understand what was happening. Amara sat down in a seat in the back of the plane, between two unfamiliar passengers who seemed indifferent to her presence. No apology was offered by flight attendant Vanessa, no assistance, no empathy. The seats were not as soft as those in first class, and there was no comfort that she had been accustomed to. Now, all that remained was a cramped, cold space. She placed her bag on the floor, her eyes focused intently on the back of the seat in front of her, trying not to let herself become too frustrated. Meanwhile, in the first-class cabin, Marcus showed no signs of anger. Despite having witnessed how his wife was treated, he did not say anything, simply sitting there, staring straight ahead, his eyes fixed on the window. But inside, a fire was igniting that could not be extinguished. He knew this was not a random act. It was a deliberate action, one born of bias and discrimination. Although Marcus did not speak out immediately, he could not sit idly by and let this go unchecked. He took out his phone, reaching over his son Tiu Min's shoulder, and quickly typed a message. Sending it out, just a few short words, but each one carried a weighty decision. "Move my wife to the back. This cannot happen," Marcus wrote, and pressed send. A few seconds later, Marcus's phone vibrated, signaling a new message. He opened it and read quickly, "Message received, processing." Without needing anything further, Marcus folded the phone shut and closed his eyes for a few seconds. He understood that this battle was not just about protecting his wife, but about defending the rights of all passengers, the right to be respected and treated fairly, no matter who they were. Back with Amara, sitting between two strangers, no one said anything, no one looked at her. But the curious glances from those around her were undeniable. Amara realized that not only Vanessa, but even the other passengers were watching her. And in their minds, one question lingered. Why are they silent? Those moments of silence felt endless. Amara did not speak, but she could feel the covert glances, the uncomfortable stares from the people around her. She knew they, too, felt uneasy, but no one dared to speak up. Their silence seemed to have tacitly supported the injustice unfolding. It was in that moment, as the other passengers seemed to turn their backs on the injustice, that Amara realized something important. She was not the only one suffering, and her silence did not mean she agreed with what had happened. It was simply her way of facing the disappointment, of confronting the injustice without being buried by anger. While Amara sat alone in the back, Marcus had made a clear decision. He typed another message, this time to a close friend who held power in the airline industry. "I need your help. This flight is not just an incident. It's an issue of racial discrimination within the company. I will not let this pass without action." Marcus did not only want this issue resolved immediately, but he also wanted to ensure that it would not be seen as just a personal issue for his family. It had to be a wake-up call for the entire system. He knew that if nothing was done, this problem would continue to repeat itself, not just for his family, but for thousands of other passengers who had no opportunity to speak up. At that moment, Vanessa had no idea that Marcus's message had been sent, and a chain of events was about to be set in motion. The flight attendant continued walking through the cabin, as if nothing extraordinary had happened, carrying on with her duties with calmness. But as she passed Marcus's row once more, he looked directly into her eyes, unblinking, saying nothing. It was a powerful and commanding gaze. Vanessa stopped for a moment, then continued walking, but inside, she couldn't shake the heaviness in the air. Why did she feel this way? Because she knew, no matter how many policies or regulations existed, that when self-respect and rights were violated, there would always be people who dared to stand up and change it. And Marcus was not the only one in this cabin who felt that. As the plane had been flying for a while, The atmosphere in the first-class cabin no longer felt as comfortable as it did at first. Tension hung in the air. Though no one spoke, everyone could feel it. Amara sat silently in the back, her hands clenched tightly, but her mind was constantly turning. She looked out the window, watching the fluffy white clouds float by like distant, faded memories. But inside her soul, there was something very clear: patience, strength, and silence. Inside the first-class cabin, where Marcus and the children were seated, everything seemed calmer. But within the father, there was a storm that could not be quelled. The feeling of helplessness as his wife was treated this way could not easily be brushed away. However, Marcus did not choose to explode, to shout or demand his rights violently. Instead, he chose silence, a silence full of power. This silence was not submission, but a courageous decision. Marcus knew that sometimes, loud actions cannot change a system deeply ingrained in habit. Instead, he had chosen a wiser approach. Instead of fighting with words, he would fight with action. His silence had sent a message more powerful than any words could express. But in the plane cabin, not everyone could understand the power of this silence. Some passengers had begun to feel the unease, the discomfort spreading through the air. There was a man sitting a few rows away, who had overheard the conversation between Vanessa and the Whitmore family, and he felt a significant shift in his mind. He, a middle-aged man wearing a white shirt and black trousers, a nondescript appearance compared to the other passengers, but his gaze shone with a spark of determination. He had witnessed what had happened, the discrimination, and the way Amara had been treated. Although he didn't know the full story, he had noticed something wasn't right. Other passengers might turn away, might ignore it, but he couldn't. He glanced at Marcus, who was sitting silently, not saying a word. He couldn't help but notice the patience in the man's eyes. It wasn't weakness, it was strength, the strength of silence. In the plane cabin, beyond the Whitmore family, this man began to think about what he had witnessed. Could he stand up and do something to change the situation? Could he speak up to defend the values he believed in? He asked himself, if I don't speak up, who will? These thoughts did not leave his mind throughout the flight. Though he remained silent, he began to feel the weight of responsibility more than ever. The big question in his mind now was, change might come from the silence of a family. But do I have the courage to stand up and do something? The flight continued, and while everyone remained seated, the air gradually became stifling. Vanessa continued with her duties, still unaware that her actions had been and were continuing to change how people viewed the company and herself. The flight attendant moved through the cabin, serving passengers as usual. But each step she took felt heavier. She couldn't avoid feeling the eyes of those around her, those who no longer looked at her with respect as they once had. Vanessa's feeling at that moment was one of uncertainty and ambiguity. She didn't know exactly what awaited her after the plane landed. Would she be reprimanded? Would she be fired? Would she have to face an investigation? Those questions swirled in her mind like waves relentlessly crashing against her. But she knew that any decision now couldn't return to the initial moment, when she was still a confident flight attendant, when she had never faced criticism. By this point, Vanessa realized that not all passengers could simply turn a blind eye to racism and injustice. People like Marcus, Amara, and even the other passengers were proof of an important lesson. No one has the right to decide who deserves to sit where, especially when they've paid for respect and fairness. Meanwhile, Marcus continued to sit still, his eyes not leaving the window. He knew that things would change, even if not immediately. He could feel something very powerful, and he understood that his silence and his family's silence had created an influence far greater than anything that could be said. Beside him, Tiu Lai and Tiu Min had calmed down, though both still had small questions in their minds. But Marcus simply smiled and gently told his son, "You'll understand when you're older." These words weren't just for Tiu Min. They were also a message that Marcus wanted to convey to everyone listening to this story, even if they didn't realize it right away. As the plane continued through the sky, the entire cabin became quiet. not because of peace, but because of awakening. The awakening in the hearts of each passenger, the realization of an issue that could no longer be ignored, about discrimination and justice. And sometimes, silence is the most powerful way for people to reevaluate what is happening around them. As the flight gradually reached its halfway point, the atmosphere in the first-class cabin remained silent, as if the entire space had been enveloped by an invisible mist. Although no one spoke, change had begun to spread in the hearts of the passengers. Each person, even if not directly involved in the incident between Vanessa and the Whitmore family, felt a profound shift in their own awareness. Amara sat in the back, where the narrow and cold space only deepened her thoughts. Though she did not show dissatisfaction or anger, she could not forget how she had been treated. The respect she always thought was a given in first-class flights now seemed distant, all because of the unreasonable decision made by a flight attendant. She sat silently, but inside, questions spun relentlessly. Why had she been treated this way? Why could someone so easily dismiss her rights over such a small issue? Amara could not help but feel disappointed, but she did not allow herself to be consumed by that feeling. She knew she had to remain strong for her children, to maintain her composure, and not let the injustice shake the values that she and her family had built. On the other side, Marcus still sat at the front, his gaze directed out the window. But his mind was far from calm. He was thinking about how to address the issue. He knew that once something like this happened, no words or rash reactions could change anything. What he needed to do was make this an opportunity for a lesson, not only for Vanessa, but for everyone who witnessed the situation. His silence was not submission. It was a powerful action, a statement of resolve, and a signal to everyone that he would not let this injustice pass without action. In the first-class cabin, the passengers still sat silently, some occasionally glancing toward Marcus, but no one dared to speak. Some had even begun to feel uneasy. They knew that what they had witnessed was not normal. Though the incident had been a minor seating dispute, it reflected a deeper issue, the problem of racism and power in society. And in that moment, those passengers who remained silent became complicit in that silence. It was then that a man, sitting a few rows away from Marcus, began to feel discomfort in his heart. He was a middle-aged man with an unremarkable appearance, but his gaze could not ignore the injustice that the Whitmore family was facing. He had seen the entire event unfold, and though he didn't know all the details, he could sense that something was wrong in the way Vanessa treated Amara. When Vanessa passed him again, he looked at her with suspicion. She continued her work calmly, but his eyes were filled with concern and a heavy feeling. He felt compelled to do something, to speak up, but did he have the courage to do so? The silence in the cabin was no longer the typical quiet. It was a repression, a compression of emotions, thoughts, and worries that each person in the cabin was facing. A few passengers began to feel ashamed. They had witnessed a family being treated unfairly and had done nothing. And in that moment, they too realized that they had a responsibility in creating a more just and respectful environment. Suddenly, Marcus's phone vibrated. He didn't need to look. Just hearing the brief words in the message was enough for him to understand that things were being handled. The message from his close friend in the airline industry was clear. The meeting has been held. This issue will be addressed as soon as the plane lands. The feeling of anxiety within Marcus seemed to dissipate. He knew that his decision was not a hasty reaction, but a purposeful action. He was not only protecting his family, but he was also fighting for justice, for those passengers who would face discrimination and lack the strength to resist. Back with Amara, she sat in silence, but inside, a small flame began to ignite. She felt that the injustice she was enduring was not only affecting her, but also everyone around her. She understood that silence was not surrender. Silence was strength. Silence was an opportunity for everyone to reflect on themselves. As the plane began its descent, the cabin began to buzz with activity, with flight attendants preparing for landing. Yet the atmosphere in the first-class cabin remained heavy. Every passenger, though no one spoke, could feel the change in the space. It was not just silence, but a confrontation with a truth that no one could ignore. At that moment, as the plane began to slow, the eyes of the passengers began to turn toward Marcus and his family. Some felt guilty, some felt uneasy, but all of them realized that Marcus and Amara's silence had conveyed a message more powerful than any words could express. Marcus and Amara didn't need to explain anything. They didn't need to present arguments or call for justice. Their silence had said it all. And as the plane landed, the only thing they needed was fairness. And when everything settled, it was their silence that would ignite the flames for the changes to come. As the plane began its descent, the atmosphere in the cabin grew unusually tense. The sound of the engines gradually softened, giving way to the rustling noises of passengers preparing to leave their seats. But for Marcus and Amara, despite the change in the air, they couldn't feel the peace that other passengers might have been experiencing. Everything still felt too heavy for them. The silence was not peace, but rather a waiting for a change they knew was coming. A change not just to protect their family, but to protect all those who would face discrimination in the future. As the plane glided through the cool air of the clouds, something strange happened. Unlike other flights, where everyone eagerly prepared for the next leg of their journey, this flight seemed to be slowing down in a serious manner. The passengers in the cabin remained silent, their eyes turning toward Marcus and his family. They didn't speak, but in their gazes, there was empathy, remorse, and a hint of shame. Amara and Marcus didn't need to turn back to look for those eyes. Their gaze was their voice, the acknowledgement of the silence they had chosen to cope with the injustice. Amara's hands remained tightly clasped together, but not out of fear or tension, but because she understood that the silence in this moment was not weakness. Silence was the strength that she and her family had chosen. While Marcus maintained his calm, without any sign of resistance, a man sitting near him could no longer stay still. This man, who had previously been just another ordinary passenger, now felt an uncontrollable urge to act. He had witnessed too much silence, too many glances turned away, too many injustices buried in small events like this one. And in this moment, he realized that if he continued to remain silent, if he did nothing, then he too was part of the injustice. When the plane finally stopped at the gate and passengers began to leave their seats to prepare to disembark, this man could not stay quiet any longer. He stood up, slightly anxious, but unable to ignore what had happened. He walked toward the Whitmore family, courage growing within him. "Excuse me," he said, his voice trembling but sincere. "I couldn't sit still after seeing this happen. I want to apologize for the way you were treated. This is wrong, and I'm sorry I didn't do anything from the start." Marcus and Amara looked at him, but not with discomfort or anger. Instead, their gaze was one of appreciation, because at least, in that small moment, another passenger had recognized what was wrong and chosen to stand up. Amara smiled gently, nodding her head slightly as if offering thanks. "Thank you for speaking up," Amara said, her voice soft but full of strength. "Sometimes, just one word can change everything." The man nodded, and then he turned around, seeming to have lifted a burden from his chest. The cabin remained silent, but it no longer felt as heavy as before. Those around began to realize that, in a world full of injustice, even a small act of courage and sincerity could change everything. Just as the plane came to a halt and the door opened, a group of uniformed individuals entered the cabin. They were security staff, along with a few others, including a man in a black suit, whom Marcus immediately recognized. He was the CEO of the airline, the person behind many of the major decisions in the company. Marcus Whitmore, the CEO, said as he approached, his tone serious, but not without respect. "We apologize for the incident that occurred. We've received the information about the situation and held an immediate meeting to address this issue." Marcus didn't respond right away. He looked at the CEO, his eyes still calm, but clearly with a sense of frustration. "I don't just want an apology, I want change," Marcus said, his voice firm. We can't let things like this continue to happen. Not just in your company, but in the entire airline industry. The CEO nodded, seemingly recognizing that this issue wasn't simply about resolving a personal incident. This was a larger problem, a systemic issue. We will investigate and take disciplinary action, he said, as well as implement training programs on racism and ethics in the workplace. Marcus didn't look at him. Instead, he turned to Amara and then looked at their children. This is the time for action, he said quietly. We will do everything to protect those who don't have a voice. Amara looked at him, the strength in her eyes unchanged. She knew this fight was not just for her and her family. It was the fight for all those who have, are, and will endure discrimination. As the Whitmore family exited the plane, the atmosphere in the airport seemed to change. The passengers who followed no longer seemed like just people passing by. It was as if they were now reflecting on what they had just witnessed. They didn't speak, but in each of their eyes, they understood that silence was not always a choice. And as they walked away, a quiet awakening began to spread, not only in the minds of the passengers, but also within the very organization. They had just left an organization now faced with questions about justice, equality, and human rights. After the Whitmore family exited the plane and passed through security, the atmosphere at the airport seemed to subtly change. Their footsteps were no longer those of people simply leaving a flight. Each step now felt like a silent declaration, a confirmation that justice is not always fought with loud words, but can be affirmed through steadfast action, even if those around them remain silent or turn away. When Marcus looked at their children, he saw curiosity in Tiu Lai and Tiu Min's eyes, a desire to understand what had just happened. The questions still echoed in their minds, even though both children tried to remain quiet, not wanting to worry their parents further. But Marcus understood that today would be a significant lesson for them, not only about fairness, but also about how to stand firm in a world full of challenges that are not easily overcome. Amid the silence and tension in the airport space, the CEO of the airline, who had met with Marcus right after the plane landed, walked in alongside several security staff members. They appeared to have prepared some measures to address the incident, but Marcus knew that this was just the first step in a long process. One of the people who had been following the Whitmore family's journey from start to finish was Jenna, a new flight attendant, who had witnessed the entire event unfold, although she hadn't spoken up at the time. The way she followed Amara and Marcus with her eyes made her feel ashamed of what she had witnessed. As the CEO and security personnel approached Marcus and his family, the air grew even more tense. The CEO bowed his head, showing respect to Marcus. "We sincerely apologize for the incident," he said, his voice stern but tinged with remorse. "We've suspended Vanessa's employment and have initiated a comprehensive investigation into the matter." Marcus remained still, not hurried to respond. He looked at the CEO, his gaze sharp, as if warning him of what was about to come. "You need to do more than that," he said, his voice unwavering. "I want real change. I don't just want this to stop at an investigation. I want measures that will truly prevent situations like this from happening in the future." The CEO nodded, but Marcus could feel that his response lacked decisiveness. "We've already begun taking specific steps to improve our screening processes and staff training," the CEO continued. "Starting next week, all employees will be required to attend courses on awareness and anti-racism. We will also establish a reporting system for passengers to raise issues during their flights." While the CEO's words seemed promising, Marcus couldn't hide his skepticism. He looked at Amara, then turned back to the CEO and slowly said, "We want to see real change. This isn't just about Vanessa. It's about ensuring that all passengers, whether they have power or not, are treated fairly and with respect." Marcus's words felt like a challenge to the CEO, a reminder of the responsibility he and the company had to bear. This flight was not just a personal incident. It was a confrontation with much bigger issues that had existed far too long in the airline industry and in society at large. And Marcus did not want his family to be just a simple example. He wanted them to be a symbol of real change. As they left the airport and got into the car on their way home, the atmosphere felt a little lighter. However, in each member of the Whitmore family, there was still an indescribable tension. Things might have temporarily settled, but Marcus and Amara both knew that they couldn't stop here. The work was still ahead of them, and the most important thing was that they had to continue on the path they had chosen, no matter how difficult or challenging it may be. Throughout the journey back, Tiu Lai and Tiu Min kept asking questions, and Marcus and Amara patiently explained. They spoke about injustice, the values their family always upheld, and how silence in a moment could turn into strength. One of Tiu Lai's questions made Marcus and Amara think longer. "Mom, Dad, what can we do so that others are treated the same way? Like how you and Dad handled this situation?" That question was like a wake-up call, reminding Marcus and Amara of the responsibility they carried. They couldn't just be examples. They had to be the ones to change the world around them. And while everything seemed to have concluded, a great change had already begun. The investigation into Vanessa would continue, and the company would not only address the issue of one flight attendant, but also face more systemic issues. Anti-racism workshops would be held. New policies would be implemented. And the most important thing was that, after this flight, Marcus and Amara knew that they were not just a family who had been treated unjustly. We're the ones who were helping to change an unjust system. The awakening did not just come from what happened on the plane, but from the silent actions of the Whitmore family. Their silence was not surrender, it was a strategic action, a statement of strength and patience. And as the passengers disembarked from the flight, no one could forget that story. For in a world full of chaos and noise, sometimes silence is the most powerful voice. The Whitmore family returned home in silence. That evening, as they gathered together, no one could deny that the events that had transpired had marked a significant turning point in their lives. However, even in the peaceful space of their home, the shadow of what had happened still weighed heavily on each of them. Tiu Lai and Tiu Min had returned to their childhood games, but their eyes occasionally still glimmered with curiosity. For them, the injustice their mother and father had faced was a vague concept, something they could not fully grasp yet. But the silence their family had chosen allowed them to sense something much bigger. Marcus and Amara knew that, in the hours to come, these children would learn not just about justice, but also about how to face the difficulties life throws their way. The next day, as the first light of dawn crept through the window, new challenges began to surface. Marcus and Amara received calls from the company, partners, and organizations wanting to discuss the recent events. But what concerned them most wasn't those calls, it was the changes they would have to face in the future. The incident had not only exposed flaws within the airline industry, but also raised big questions about their role in society. While the company continued its internal investigation, a message from the airline's CEO was sent to the Whitmore family. "We are committed to making deep reforms in our human resources policies and training to stop racism. This is not just about Vanessa, but about the entire system." Although his words seemed promising, Marcus knew this would be a long fight, and true change would not come from a few simple announcements. The company had taken its first steps. A bias awareness training program had been planned for all employees, especially flight attendants and ground staff. A new reporting system would be implemented, allowing passengers to report unfair experiences during their flight, without having to wait until landing. However, Marcus still could not be at ease. He knew that change doesn't always come from policies or regulations. Sometimes it starts with a shift in people's minds. That was something he had to face. Amara, too, couldn't sit idle. She began participating in meetings with organizations advocating for the rights of vulnerable groups, especially women and children facing discrimination on flights. She knew that waiting for change from those in power wouldn't bring about quick progress. Amara wanted to stand up and contribute to this fight. With each meeting, each speech, she felt stronger and more confident. She understood that she wasn't just doing this for her family, but for those who had no voice in society. In an important meeting with airline industry leaders, Marcus asked a question that silenced the entire room. Are we truly ready to change the system we've built over decades, or are we just addressing a temporary incident? This question shocked many in the room because it indicated that this revolution wasn't just about training employees, but about a comprehensive change in how the entire airline industry operates. A public letter from the company soon began to circulate. Marcus's friends and colleagues shared his family's story with others, and within a few days, it became a hot topic on social media. The incident was no longer just a family story. It became a national conversation about justice and how society treats the disadvantaged. What was most important was that, while Marcus and Amara were working to change the airline industry, they didn't forget to teach their children lessons about fairness and courage. Every evening after a day of work, they sat together, sharing thoughts and feelings about what had transpired. Tiu Lai and Tiu Min began to understand that justice is not always easily achieved, and sometimes you must fight not just for yourself, but for others as well. 1 week after the incident, a video capturing the entire event between the Whitmore family and flight attendant Vanessa was posted on social media. Surprisingly, this video attracted attention not only from the airline industry, but also caused a stir in the community. Comments praising the composure and strength of the Whitmore family flooded the social media pages. Their story became a symbol of patience and the power of silence. While many shared words of gratitude and sympathy with the Whitmore family, Marcus and Amara knew this was just the beginning. Change couldn't come from a viral video or an interview alone. To achieve real change, they needed to keep fighting, continue to apply pressure to create a fairer system, and ensure that their voices weren't just part of a short-term revolution, but a part of lasting change in society. With the first steps now taken, Marcus and Amara felt their belief in justice strengthened. But they knew that in a society full of biases and injustice, the road ahead was still long, and they would not stop until everyone could hold their heads high and be treated fairly, not just on a plane, but in every area of life. The day the Whitmore family walked out of the courtroom, a new era began for them. That fateful flight had not only changed their lives, but had also sparked a wave of change throughout society, marking the start of a long journey ahead. They were no longer just a family. They had become symbols of the relentless fight for justice, equality, and respect for every individual in society. As the Whitmore family's story became a hot topic in the media, calls for reform in the airline industry came not only from human rights organizations, but also from passengers within and outside the industry. For Marcus and Amara, this was the result of their actions, not revenge or retribution, but an awakening. They had used their story to highlight an issue that could no longer be ignored. The Whitmore family's actions had a powerful impact on the airline industry. Major airlines began implementing training programs on racism, reevaluating their recruitment and flight attendant training processes. Discussions on justice and equality were being held more widely, not only within the companies but also in communities. These conversations helped people become more aware of what was happening on flights, where racism wasn't just occurring in isolated situations, but was sometimes embedded within the system itself. With the positive changes taking place, Marcus and Amara never forgot their initial goal, not only to reclaim justice for their family, but also to create a fair and respectful environment for all. Although they had won a major victory in court and helped change industry practices, they knew that their story wasn't the end. It was a turning point for the ongoing efforts. In the fight for justice, big questions still remained. Could this change last? Would the reforms truly make a difference in the long run? Would those in power in society truly change the way they saw and treated the oppressed? Marcus and Amara knew the battle wasn't over. Despite achieving so much, there was still a long road ahead. After tireless efforts, Amara decided to join larger organizations and international movements advocating for the rights of women and children, to protect those without a voice. She began attending conferences, sharing her family's story with influential people, aiming to convince them of the need to build a more just social system. Each time she stood in front of an audience, Amara felt stronger, knowing that what she said wasn't just a personal sharing, but a call for change, for all those suffering discrimination. Marcus, who had once been the CEO of a major corporation, shifted his career focus to leading social justice initiatives. He knew that he couldn't change everything in one day, but he believed that every conversation, every event he attended, contributed to changing people's mindsets. He and Amara began organizing training programs on fairness and human rights, not only within the airline industry, but also expanding into other fields such as education, healthcare, and multinational corporations. The Whitmore family's story wasn't just written in books. It had become part of history in the fight for justice. People in the community, whether strangers or allies, viewed them as symbols of perseverance and courage. They had not only faced their own challenges, but had sparked a larger wave throughout society. The stories of silence, patience, and courage from the Whitmore family had inspired many others to stand up and fight for their own rights. 1 year after the incident, the Whitmore family received an invitation to appear on a major television program, where they would share their story with the world. They smiled and agreed, not because they wanted the attention, but because they knew their story would continue to spread and impact even more people. During the recording, when asked about their feelings after everything they had been through, Amara gently responded, "We're not doing this for fame or recognition. We're doing it for all those who don't have the opportunity to speak up. Every story, every small action contributes to changing the world, and we're proud to be part of that change." And when the cameras turned off, when the lights dimmed, Marcus and Amara looked at each other without needing to say much. They knew their work wasn't finished. They knew the challenges were still there, but now, they were no longer alone. They had each other, they had allies, and most importantly, they had a firm belief in the power of change. The story ended, but the journey had only just begun. After the trial concluded, and the changes in the airline industry began to take root, the Whitmore family not only emerged as victors in a legal battle, but they also became symbols of resilience and courage. Yet, for Marcus and Amara, this victory was not the end, but rather the beginning of a long journey ahead. They knew that change could not come immediately, but each small step would contribute to a clear and undeniable difference. Following the trial, the airline company implemented a series of reforms they had committed to, from training employees on anti-racism awareness to creating an online feedback system to help passengers report discriminatory behaviors during flights. However, Marcus and Amara knew that this was only the first step in a lengthy process, and it couldn't stop at superficial changes. They didn't want their family's story to merely serve as a temporary warning. They wanted it to be a guiding light for real, lasting change in society. The two began engaging in more conversations, not just with social organizations, but also with industry leaders, sharing their story and encouraging others to take action. They realized that, to make this change spread, they couldn't do it alone. They needed allies, people who could see and understand the importance of eliminating discrimination in every area of life. One major turning point in the Whitmore family's journey was when they began organizing workshops on justice and equality in society. These workshops not only attracted industry experts, but also provided a space for ordinary people, those without power or a loud voice, to share their stories. Amara and Marcus knew that every story shared was a step forward, not only for them but for all those who felt forgotten or excluded. Gradually, their workshops began to attract attention from international organizations. One of the first participants was Jenna, the young flight attendant the Whitmore family had encountered on the flight. Jenna had followed their story and realized that she, too, needed to change her perspective on her work. She understood that her job wasn't just about serving customers, it was about representing a system, a company whose actions could impact the lives of millions. She began attending training sessions and became a part of the company's changing campaign. Jenna was not just a participant. She became one of the leaders organizing discussions on racism within the company, where employees could talk about their experiences and learn from one another. She also began leading small conversations among staff, helping them better understand their roles and responsibilities in creating a more fair and harmonious workplace environment. A significant change also began to occur in the way passengers viewed each other. Stories from previous flights, where passengers had remained silent when witnessing discrimination, were now being shared. A group of passengers spoke up, calling for airline policy reforms, demanding public reporting on discriminatory behaviors during flights, and strict measures against attendants who violated these standards. These passengers, though not in positions of power, realized that the strength of solidarity could change everything. And in those conversations, Marcus and Amara recognized that the fight was not theirs alone. Everyone could participate, whether little or much, in creating a fairer society. When the Whitmore family received an invitation to an international conference on civil rights and equality, they knew they had stepped beyond the bounds of a simple lawsuit. Their story had spread widely, and they had become part of a larger movement fighting for justice for all, regardless of who they were, where they came from, or what they carried with them. The Whitmore family's story had become a testament to change, but also a reminder that no one could remain passive when fundamental human rights were being violated. They were not just a family fighting for their own rights, but also those who had opened the door to dialogues and changes within the airline industry, and more broadly, in society. At a ceremony held by a major human rights organization, where they were honored for their contributions to the fight against racism, Amara gave a short but powerful speech. "We're not doing this for ourselves," she said. "We're doing it for all those who don't have the opportunity to speak up. We can't change the past, but we can ensure that the future won't be like what we went through." Her words were not just a speech, but a clear message. The fight for justice is a long one, but it's worth fighting for, and none of them, whether Marcus, Amara, or their allies, would stop until they saw true change. When the Whitmore family walked out of the courtroom, a new era began for them. That fateful flight had changed not only their lives, but had also sparked a wave of change in society, marking the beginning of a long journey ahead. They were no longer just a family. They had become symbols of the relentless struggle for justice, equality, and respect for every individual in society. As the story of the Whitmore family became a hot topic in the media, calls for reform in the airline industry came not only from human rights organizations, but also from passengers inside and outside the industry. For Marcus and Amara, this was the result of their actions, not revenge or retribution, but an awakening. They had used their story to highlight an issue that could no longer be ignored. The actions of the Whitmore family had a powerful impact on the airline industry. Major airlines began implementing training programs on racism, reevaluating their recruitment and flight attendant training processes. Conversations about justice and equality were being held more widely, not just within companies but in communities as well. These discussions helped people become more aware of what was happening on flights, where racism didn't just occur in isolated situations, but was sometimes embedded within the system itself. With the positive changes taking place, Marcus and Amara never forgot their initial goal, not only to reclaim justice for their family, but also to create a fair and respectful environment for all. Although they had won a major victory in court and helped change industry practices, they knew that their story wasn't the end. It was a turning point for the ongoing efforts. In the fight for justice, big questions still remained. Could this change last? Would the reforms truly make a difference in the long run? Would those in power in society truly change the way they saw and treated the oppressed? Marcus and Amara knew the battle wasn't over. Despite achieving so much, there was still a long road ahead. After tireless efforts, Amara decided to join larger organizations and international movements advocating for the rights of women and children, to protect those without a voice. She began attending conferences, sharing her family's story with influential people, aiming to convince them of the need to build a more just social system. Each time she stood in front of an audience, Amara felt stronger, knowing that what she said wasn't just a personal sharing, but a call for change. For all those suffering discrimination, Marcus, who had once been the CEO of a major corporation, shifted his career focus to leading social justice initiatives. He knew that he couldn't change everything in one day, but he believed that every conversation, every event he attended, contributed to changing people's mindset. He and Amara began organizing training programs on fairness and human rights, not only within the airline industry, but also expanding into other fields such as education, healthcare, and multinational corporations. The Whitmore family's story wasn't just written in books. It had become part of history in the fight for justice. People in the community, whether strangers or allies, viewed them as symbols of perseverance and courage. They had not only faced their own challenges, but had sparked a larger wave throughout society. The stories of silence, patience, and courage from the Whitmore family had inspired many others to stand up and fight for their own rights. 1 year after the incident, the Whitmore family received an invitation to appear on a major television program, where they would share their story with the world. They smiled and agreed, not because they wanted the attention, but because they knew their story would continue to spread and impact even more people. During the recording, when asked about their feelings after everything they had been through, Amara gently responded, "We're not doing this for fame or recognition. We're doing this for all those who don't have the opportunity to speak up." Every story, every small action contributes to changing the world, and we're proud to be part of that change. And when the cameras turned off, when the lights dimmed, Marcus and Amara looked at each other without needing to say much. They knew their work wasn't finished. They knew the challenges were still there, but now, they were no longer alone. They had each other. They had allies, and most importantly, they had a firm belief in the power of change. The story ended, but the journey had only just begun.